Welcome back to the Keiser Report. A lot of people are scratching their head. What do we do? These banks. What's going on? Should we appoint a special commission? Is there anyone who knows what's going on? Well, fortunately, there is somebody in America that does know what's going on, who's faced the problems before, and who has solved the problems before. Welcome to the show. Let's go to Missouri to talk with Professor William K. Black. Professor Black, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
Alrighty, now, just to remind people, of course, you were a bank regulator back in the 1980s when I was working on Wall Street, and you cleaned up the S&L crisis, and you put 1,000 bankers away in jail, at least. I may have the number wrong. First, Professor Black, whatever happened to Sarbanes-Oxley? Why are we discussing how much bonuses these bankers should be getting instead of discussing how much time in jail they should be serving?
Sarbanes-Oxley had next to nothing to do with creating successful criminal prosecutions. It got focused on procedure, and ironically, it made a fortune for the Big Four audit firms that were the heart of the problem.
Talk about the racketeering here, because you've got the accounting agencies, the rating agencies, the investment banks, the hedge funds. They're all operating as a racket. Isn't that correct?
All of them have been deliberately subjected to what we in economics call a Gresham's dynamic. In a Gresham's dynamic, the least ethical gain a competitive advantage. And when that happens, marketplaces become perverse, and they drive the ethical out of the marketplace, and the people that triumph are the absolute worst folks. Now, this is deliberately engineered. For example, WAMU, it has come out, had a blacklist of appraisers, except you got on the blacklist of appraisers if you were honest.
Right. So the least ethically inclined have an advantage in this new economy. Now, if you look at what happened, let's say Argentina, circa 2000, 2001, there was wholesale looting by the elites. They stole the money and they ran away. When I hear about these Christmas bonuses on Wall Street, it seems to me that basically it's wholesale looting. It's not reform. It's not stimulus. It's not anything other than looting. Would you argue with that conclusion?
Well, to tie your questions together, Sarbanes-Oxley didn't work because it didn't deal with the fundamental perverse incentives. And the fundamental perverse incentives are the ones we've just been discussing. One is executive compensation, but the other is professional compensation. And that's what allows the CEO crooks in the financial industry to suborn all of these entities that are supposed to be independent, that are supposed to be controls, and turn them into the most valuable allies of the underlying accounting fraud, which is designed to maximize CEO and CFO bonuses. And this is why I say American business schools all too often have become fraud factories.
Okay, well, what you're describing there can also be used to describe how a mafia family works. They co-opt other people in the society to do their bidding for them, and you have a mafia-style hierarchy. But during the 1980s, of course, Rudy Giuliani went after Drexel using RICO, anti-racketeering laws, if I remember correctly. Now, why can't they bring that back? This is obviously racketeering. Why are they pussyfooting, and why don't they go after the racket as a whole?
The fundamental reason is that the FBI and the Justice Department can only be successful if the regulators serve as the Sherpas. And I mean that in the following two senses. That we as the regulators have to be the guide, but we also have to do the heavy lifting. Because we're the only ones that have the resources and the expertise in the industry to be able to make an FBI investigation successful. The Huffington Post had a superb story on this that actually I helped generate, and that they finally got the regulators to answer the question, how many criminal referrals have you done this decade? And the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, which is supposed to regulate national banks, and the Office of Thrift Supervision, which was supposed to regulate savings and loans, the answer was 0. We made well over 1,000 criminal referrals. If you don't investigate, you don't find.
Okay, William K. Black, during the S&L crisis of the 80s, how big was your staff?
My staff was 50 attorneys.
Okay, how big is the staff right now going after the problem?
The Justice Department has roughly 1/5 the staff that the Justice Department used against the savings and loan crisis, and this crisis is somewhere on the order of 40 times larger than the savings and loan crisis.
Okay, that 40 times larger. Now, the savings and loan crisis, in nominal terms or inflation-adjusted terms, it was something on the order of $600 billion?
Now, it's less than that. I can give you the figure in 1993 dollars. It was roughly $150 billion.
So you're talking about a 40 times bigger. Help me with the math here. So you're saying that we're talking about an amount of...
We're talking about losses in the 6 to 10 to 15 trillion range, depending on who you believe.
Okay, now you say 6 to 10 to 15 trillion. That's interesting because in an economy like the one in America, Walmart can tell you who's buying a razor on a Thursday at 2:30 in the afternoon with an RFID tracking system and advanced supply chain management and all kinds of interesting technological innovations. But apparently, we don't know whether we're losing 6, 10, or 15 trillion dollars out of the back door of the banking system. Don't you see a bit of a disconnect there?
Yes, exactly. That's what we've been emphasizing, the death of regulation. So what happened in this crisis compared to the savings and loan crisis is there's a cover-up in this crisis. And if you are deliberately change the accounting rules, which was done, and if the regulators deliberately don't look hard, run these sham stress tests, then you don't find remotely the true extent of the losses. And if you don't investigate, you don't find the losses and you don't find the fraud. Therefore, the quality of information that we have in this crisis is vastly worse. Now, remember, we had over 1,000 successful felony prosecutions. We had several thousand successful enforcement actions, and we had roughly 1,000 successful civil actions. Think how many facts come out in the course of all of those investigations that give you an incredibly accurate picture of what happened. None of that has happened. Name a really large civil suit by the government against any of the parties that specialized in the non-prime lending. Name a huge enforcement action that actually went to some kind of hearing and information was made public. It hasn't happened.
Let me ask you something. You're saying $10 trillion, to use a round number, in losses. The Federal Reserve and Barack Obama have thrown quantitative easing and stimulus packages at these losses to try to get the economy starting again, but the economy is rolling over and playing dead again, which is to infer that there are more losses yet to be disclosed. Now, William K. Black, I know that's a bit of a guessing game because no one's providing accurate information. But what is yet to be revealed in this debt vortex? Is it another 10 trillion yet to be revealed in debt?
Well, there are two different things going on. First, there is a really severe recession, and that really severe recession has reduced private demand somewhere in the range of $6 trillion. The stimulus bill is, of course, roughly $800 billion. So you can see that it isn't remotely going to fill the hole in lost demand, and you actually have to net out of the stimulus bill a $200 billion reduction in state and local funding. Now, there's a second thing. How big are the losses? The IMF and the administration originally estimated the losses in the $2 to $2.5 trillion range. And we know that the recession and the loss in housing values turned out to be far worse than the initial estimates, right? And you can see what losses are being recognized by the banks, and it's nowhere near that, and we know why. Because the banks use their political pull to get Congress to extort the Financial Accounting Standards Board, FASB, to change the accounting rules so the banks don't have to recognize the losses unless and until they actually sell the assets. So what happened? while there has been a massive increase in delinquencies, there's an enormous lag in foreclosures. And even when there's foreclosures, there's an enormous lag in selling the assets. This is the Japanese strategy of covering up the losses, and it prevents markets from recovering. That's why Japan had the lost decade, which is really 2 lost decades.
So you're saying on the demand side, we know there's been a drop in demand, and on the missing the black hole of debt, we know it's been understated. We know that they haven't marked to market the value of this debt. It's still sitting there on the balance sheet, yet to be marked to market at some point. The theory in the Fed and the Treasury is to somehow paper over this problem, extend and pretend, and to get some Hail Mary pass, something is going to come along to do what you decided you needed to do in the S&L crisis. You ring-fenced all that debt. Here, they've done none of that ring-fencing. So all the crooks, they're still in place. How come no one has ring-fenced the crooks?
I know you think you're a pessimist, but you're actually an optimist. It's actually worse. The reason you gimmick the accounting rules is so that these guys can still pay their bonuses to themselves.
Right. So this was a big lesson from the savings and loan crisis, was not to act more ethically, but how do we change the law so that next time we do the same fraud, we won't get caught? Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, worse than that again, because after the savings and loan crisis, we passed the prompt corrective action law, which mandates the closure of these insolvent banks. But it has what we told them as a huge Achilles heel. And that is, if you gimmick the accounting rules, you can gimmick the prompt corrective action law. And that's what's happened. That's the Japanese strategy of covering up. We sold bad assets promptly, and that allowed markets to recover and what we call clear. If you keep a huge overhang of inventory that everybody knows is out there, then markets don't recover.
All right, finally, one last question. What about the possibility of citizen arrests? Is this a viable possibility?
No. But citizens can demand that these folks act against the major frauds. They can demand that they clean up the accounting. That's just a complete obscenity to be able to gimmick the accounting so that you continue to pay yourself massive bonuses for destroying major financial institutions. Citizens can demand an end to the systemically dangerous institutions. These are the SDIs, roughly 20 of them. The Treasury says if a single one of them goes, they will cause a global crisis. We know there are absolutely no economies of scale at that size. In fact, it's quite the opposite. They're far less efficient because they're so gargantuan. We know that their political power causes immense problems, and we know that they are a ticking time bomb for the world economy. So the citizens can demand that those SDIs, the systemically dangerous institutions, be shrunk to the point that they no longer threaten a global crisis.
All right, that's all the time we have. This time, William K. Black, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report. I want to thank my guests, Stacey Herbert and William K. Black. Hi, welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to Iceland and speak with Brigitte Jónsdóttir. She's a member of Parliament in Iceland. Brigitte, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Well, thank you very much. I'm happy to be back.
All right, Brigitte. Last week, the Icelandic government and the IMF co-hosted a conference, Iceland's Recovery, Lessons and Challenges. Before we discuss the conference, give the audience a brief outline of the collapse in Iceland.
Oh, wow. So in 2008, we had the third largest financial meltdown in the history of humankind. Prior to that, we were the most developed nation according to the UN in 2007. 2008, we were put under terrorist act, or one of our banks with the Icelandic name associated to it, on the anti-terrorist list alongside with North Korea, Zimbabwe.
Okay, let me stop you right there. So in other words, some global authorities recognized that the Icelandic bankers were terrorists, and they put them on the terrorist watch list, or they've been hunting them down as terrorists?
Oh, no. They are still investing, unfortunately. One of them is still on the list of the richest people in the world. Unfortunately, none of the people responsible for the Ponzi scheme in relation to the banks has been persecuted. To my understanding, though, it is very difficult to get these people charged because many of them, the people that run the banks, they co-write the laws. So they know which loopholes to use and which gray zones to skate on. So I'm not sure if the people responsible from robbing the banks from inside will ever be held accountable. And this is, of course, not only a problem in Iceland, but all over the world.
It's hard to believe because they were able to get Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein. What was the name of the primary terrorist in Iceland that people are trying to find and prosecute and hopefully hang? What's his name again?
Björgúlfur Thor Björgúlfsson. He is actually one of the prime investors in a new data center in Iceland called Wern Holding. And he was responsible for ISAFE. But there are some good news in relation to that. Just 3 days ago, there was a court ruling finally in relation to if the emergency laws that we put through in order to deal with the financial collapse will hold or not. They will hold, and that means that the British and the Dutch governments will get all their money back without the Icelandic taxpayers put on, because there is an ESA court ruling imminent, or a court case if we breach the EEA law.
Yeah, that's right. David Cameron and the government in Netherlands, they are being held hostage by banking terrorists in their countries, and they need the Icelandic people to help them fund the extortion money. Now, when Iceland is dealing with the IMF, how much debt did Iceland take from the IMF, and what did the IMF demand in exchange for their loans?
Well, this is all a very interesting story, actually. According to the finance minister and the central bank manager in Iceland, we have not used any of the loan from the IMF, but we still haven't given it back to them, even if we are supposed to be finished in the program. The interesting thing is the IMF has now decided to use Iceland as a promotional kit for them being the new cuddly and soft IMF. I had to remind the people from the IMF at the conference in Iceland last week about their policy in Greece and their policy and program in Lithuania, where they indeed have not changed anything from the previous disasters in Asia. But they're still trying to market the IMF as if it has changed. And I think it's dangerous. Many economists and so forth look at the Icelandic example as a proof that the IMF has changed. Now, hear my warning, they have not. And even if they have not gone as harshly in Iceland, there is, for example, one story that was not discussed at this conference at all, and that is that one of our energy companies was sold to a foreign company, like one of these drawer companies. They created a drawer company in Sweden in order to buy it, and they were a front for the Pan American Silver Corporation from Canada. And they managed to get a resource that should indeed remain in the ownership of the nation.
Okay, let me cut you in there for a second. So in other words, Iceland did not use the IMF loans, but the IMF is still going forward with asset sales of Icelandic-owned properties anyway, and they're using Iceland as the poster child for their activities in Greece. I don't understand. I mean, they have the perfect poster child in Dominic Strauss-Kahn. He's got to be the financial rapist of the century. How come they don't push him? Has Christine Lagarde been to your country yet to let you know the good news that the IMF is there to help you?
No, we haven't seen Christine in Iceland yet, but we had an IMF deputy managing director speaking at this conference in a panel. She said that the IMF had, indeed in Iceland, helped strengthening the welfare system, which is, of course, a ludicrous lie. We have basically we already had rather weak both healthcare and educational system here prior to the IMF because of 18 years of the Independence Party. But we're having exodus out of Iceland. We don't even have properly staffed hospitals, and all the hospitals now they've been slashed so badly that we've been getting letters from all of them, the parliamentarians in Iceland, just basically saying that they can't cut anymore unless we will have health hazards. And the same applies to the educational system. And of course, usually the people that can't defend themselves have the most difficult time in that sort of austerity measures. So even if we have women at the top of the IMF, I don't think it has changed yet. And I don't think it will ever change because we all know what the function of the IMF is. And that is not to look after the people, but to look after the people that have the power. So they're looking after the 1%, not the 99%.
All right, now Iceland did stiff the bondholders on the collapsed banks in Iceland, something that you're not seeing in Ireland or Greece, where the bondholders are being made whole. So that piece of the equation in Iceland, anyway, seems to have gone in favor of the population. What are your thoughts on this aspect of the whole catastrophe?
Well, I think there are some things that can be learned from Iceland, but we have to bear in mind that Iceland is, of course, a little bit special. It was not because the Icelandic government was so smart that they decided to let the banks fail. They just couldn't get the money to save them. And then, everybody thought that was really bad, but that actually has turned out to be a great blessing for us, that all the three banks were actually allowed to fail. But one of the differences between Iceland and many other countries is that many of the people that had money in the banks or shares or, owned some of this toxic material inside them were not Icelanders, but they were mostly foreign-owned, so they collapsed on foreign stakeholders. That would not be the case, for example, if a bank would collapse in France. So that was a blessing in disguise that we had been used as a hedge fund for foreign traders. But some countries might actually want to consider to let the banks fail. I think in general, what people are calling for now all over the world is that the banks will become small enough and that they will be separated and held more accountable, and that we should indeed just have sort of community-based banks for the people in the communities, and then the people that want to run wild with their bubbles can do that in peace, maybe in the city of London.
Well, any economy anywhere thrives on competition. And if you have too big to fail banks, that means you don't have competition. And the IMF is saying that, wait a minute, we don't want competition in Iceland's banking system. We want to put it together with our global bailout funds to continue the too big to fail motif that has destroyed these economies but made our staff extraordinarily wealthy and everyone associated with our staff. So yes, competition needs to have actual multiple entrants into a market competing with each other. But let's get back to the conference that you were recently attending, because we were reading your tweets from the conference, and you tweeted that Citigroup, their chief economist, William Boter, said that there should be a jubilee, a debt jubilee, every 50 years. Your thoughts on how that was received?
That was a surprise to many of us. He said there should be debt jubilee every 50 years, and we had reached the year 49 or 50. So he was basically saying that we should have debt jubilee in Iceland. Maybe that time has come everywhere. Maybe it's time that we start anew. And I think that what I've been hearing everywhere is that people don't trust in the system, any aspect of the system, because the system is self-serving. It doesn't matter if it's the financial system or other systems. So, yeah, why don't we take this good man's advice and have debt jubilee everywhere?
Well, the gold and silver vigilantes are going to force the issue one way or another. The governments can put off the inevitable as long as they want. It's not stopping gold and silver from continuing to go higher. Well, finally, Brigitte, a question from Facebook.com/Keiser Report from Jesse Kersey, who asks, Does Brigitte believe that the Greek and or Portuguese lawmakers have the cojones to take back their sovereignty, or is it too late for them? And let me just also add here, from what you're saying here today, the IMF is so intricately involved in the Icelandic banking situation today that it's not clear that Iceland really has avoided loss of sovereignty yet, is it, Brigitte?
Yeah, indeed. It's not clear. And obviously the banks were rebuilt just as they were. And there's so much bank secrecy that even the finance minister doesn't have access to who owns the banks that have been resurrected out of the old banks.
So there's still no transparency in the Icelandic banking system, even though you were unmercifully financially raped by HSBC, Barclays, Lloyds of London, Lehman, Bear, Goldman, JP Morgan. You were gangbanged unmercifully. There's still no transparency in Iceland.
Incredible, isn't it? We've been fighting for it, me and a few other people in the parliament, but we are just speaking to deaf ears. And I think that we have to bear in mind that most politicians or, people in power are puppets. They're puppets for the financial sector. And we just have to face it. And it is really time that we look beyond the traditional politics because, let's face it, our democracies, they are dictatorship with many heads because we, the people, we do not have access to decision making or to make sure that they are doing their jobs in favor of our needs and the needs of the great many, but only the few.
All right, Brigitte Jones-Dote here. That's all the time we have for. Thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. Well, it's pretty much all a con game, and some con games are more well-known than others. Stacy Herbert.
Max Keiser, the short count con. It's a change raising con, it's known as, and is a common short con and involves an offer to change an amount of money with someone while at the same time taking change or bills back and forth to confuse the person as to how much money is actually being changed. The most common form, the short count, seen in many movies.
Yes, that movie from 20 years ago or so, Paper Moon, had a famous scene during the Depression when they were at the store and they're doing the change con. They're switching back and forth, and the person ends up with a lot less money than they thought they did. And we see this being played out on the global banking scandal scale. And as we've been saying all along, it's all based on traditional con games, just played out on much bigger time scale, much bigger size of a con, a bigger con, the biggest con of all. Remember, Paul Newman in The Sting was chasing the big con. This is really the biggest con.
Yes, this is a global scale con. Now, I thought of this short change con when I read this on Yanis Varoufakis' website. For Europe's sake, Greece must renege on its bailout commitments. My op-ed in Le Monde. It's not actually the Greek part, but it's this little thing he's talked about in Spain, and this was in mid-May. And he said the fiscally stressed Spanish government was injecting large amounts of capital into Spanish banks. Simultaneously, to help finance the Spanish state, the ECB has provided large loans to Spanish banks at 1% interest rate, which they then relent to their quote-unquote savior, i.e. the Spanish state, at interest rates often exceeding 6%.
Yes. So what we see is a quick change of debt for debt, a quick change, a con game, where the indebtedness actually increases, and the austerity measures are only going to have to be more severe because they're increasing the debt. A lot of people think that the programs in place in Europe are meant to create some kind of inflation to get some economic growth, but they're actually designed to create more deflation, more debt, more austerity, because the goal is asset stripping and neo-feudalization.
Well, it's a con. It's to take your assets and wealth. And that's it's very simple. Somebody's making money in this equation, and it's not the people.
No, it's the folks who are organizing the con game. They're, of course, making out like bandits during this process. And they every time they introduce a new fund, whether it's the Exchange Rate Stabilization Fund or the Emergency Fund A or the Emergency Fund B, these are all meant to just create more legs of the con game, to create more fees for the con artists, and to bankrupt the poor suckers like the Europeans who are getting conned by this unmerciful confiscation of wealth.
So the short change game. Remember, a lot of money has to keep on changing back and forth. You have to say, here's 10, and you give me 9 back, and I give you 10, and blah, 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 and they keep on changing money. So you get very confused over how much you actually owe and who owes who what and whose money is that and that. So solidarity, Euro style, Finnish loans, ECB bond purchases, EFSF, tough love, and assorted horror stories from the postmodern Euro workhouse. So this is about Greece. Now I want to show you another more short change con operation. Yanis Varoufakis is writing about the bankrupt Greek state was recently forced by the Troika, remember the ECB, IMF, and EU, to borrow 4.2 billion euros from the EFSF so as immediately to pass it on to the European Central Bank so as to redeem Greek government bonds that the ECB had previously purchased in a failed attempt to shore up their price. This new loan boosted Greece's debt substantially, but netted the ECB a profit of around 840 million euros, courtesy of the 20% discount at which ECB had purchased these bonds.
Right, and that profit is not used to offset the austerity measures. It goes into the pockets of the administrators and the technocrats for organizing this con game.
Well, that's what I'm saying. That's the $10 in paper moon that Ryan O'Neill and his daughter Tatum walk away with. They come out, they've stolen the money from the gas station. They walk away with the $10, and the woman is left there confused. The same here, as the Greek people are just confused. They don't know what's going on, but all they know is that they're 840 million euros shorter.
Right. And they know, the con artists, like the European technocrats, know that the victims of the con, the Europeans, whether it's the Greeks or the Spanish or the Irish, the instinct, they're too polite to question the con artists because they're smooth talking, they wear suits, they have nice hats. They come in there and they talk a good game, and they thought, well, maybe we're wrong. Maybe we're the ones that need to re-examine our position. And they're very polite, and the con artists walk out the door with their money.
Well, they're confused as it's going on. Later, when the lady in Paper Moon counts her money, she's going to find out for sure that she was $10 short. Now, we find this over and over in Europe. Well, we suddenly found a black hole of debt. We don't know where this came from. There's suddenly, in this case, there's going to be 840 million euros short in the Greek state. And they're going to say, we don't know how this came about. It's short. How did this happen? And people are going to blame the government. But nobody knows that it was actually the ECB and the bankers behind it that defrauded you.
Right, and we've seen this before too. In the UK, for example, Royal Bank of Scotland will suddenly announce, oh, we have £1 trillion, black hole of debt. We have no idea where it came from. Oh, we need to be nationalized. The executives get to keep the money they stole, and austerity measures need to be imposed. Oh, this bank has Alpha Bank in Greece. It's a huge black hole of debt. We don't know where it came from. Bankia, where's that debt? We don't know where it came from. Or MF Global and JP Morgan. Remember, JP Morgan stole 1.2 billion from customers. They stole it from the customers, and they pretended as if, and Jamie Dimon was saying, we don't know where it went. It's a black hole of debt. And he's sailing off into the sunset, drinking himself silly from all the excesses of his ill-gotten gains and con gains.
Corzine too, yeah.
Corzine also, still funding Obama. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to Seattle and talk with economist Yanis Varoufakis. Yanis, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
It's very good to be back, Max.
All right, Yanis, here we are again. Now, Spain is in line for a Greek-sized bailout, some kind of bailout that we've seen in Greece already. You liken the European aid to Greece, Spain, and the others as being a Dickensian workhouse. Explain.
Look, what was a workhouse? The workhouse was an institution under Victorian conditions, the purpose of which was to deter the poor from seeking the assistance of the rest of society. Now, similarly, the EFSF, the European Financial Stability Fund, the facility, the purpose of which is supposedly to come to the assistance of member states of the Eurozone that effectively find it impossible to refinance themselves, like Spain now. The conditions that are imposed by the EFSF, by the ECB, by the Europeans in general, on member states that need the assistance of the EFSF are Dickensian workhouse conditions. In other words, the reason why Spain has been so reluctant over the last few weeks to seek the assistance of the FSF was that life would become nasty, brutish, and short within the FSF. But you see, the whole thing has collapsed because the reason for creating workhouse conditions for the FSF, for countries like pipsqueak countries like Greece and Ireland, was to deter countries like Spain from seeking the assistance of the FSF. But the whole business of bailouts has been so toxic in Europe that now Spain, that was supposed to be deterred by the Dickensian conditions in the poorhouse and the workhouse of the FSF, is now in it anyway. So what next for Europe, except for a complete and utter disintegration?
Yes. Well, Spain was making a comment to the effect of they want the money, they want the EU money, but they don't want strings attached. So to me, it's less of a workhouse and more like a whorehouse. The first day in the whorehouse, the whore says, "Oh, I'll sleep with the customer, but I won't do X and I won't do Y and I won't do this or that." And then a week later, they're doing everything that the Johns want them to do because that's their job as a whore. Now, whether it's Greece, whether it's Spain, whether it's Ireland, they've been put into the position of being debt whores to the Troika, the ECB, the IMF, and these other whorehouse managers. They'll make a few bucks, I suppose, but they lose their sovereignty, they lose their integrity, they lose their moral compass, and they are in a bad way. What's wrong with that analogy?
A whorehouse is potentially profitable. The EFSF and all of these institutions that we've created for saving Europe, the Eurozone, the last year and a half, are impossible to sustain. So our whorehouse, to use your cruel and vulgar analogy, is effectively breaking down. It's going bankrupt. But look, Max, think of what was happening before Spain appealed to the FSF. We had the madness of the following kind of relationship between banks, the Spanish government, and Europe. These bankrupt Spanish banks were being bailed out. They've been bailed out. They've been receiving Spanish money now for a very long time. Now, the Spanish state, of course, was bankrupt. So what was the solution that the good of Europe, Mr. Draghi in particular, came up with? The LTRO. So the banks that were being bailed out by the Spanish state were borrowing from the ECB at 1% to lend to the Spanish government that was bailing them out at 6%. Now, this Ponzi austerity, and it is a Ponzi austerity because all the conditions for having this and for having the LTRO were that the Spanish government was screwing effectively the Spanish economy into the ground through austerity that is being imposed now for a year and a half. And that's why Spain is bankrupt and has to be bailed out like Ireland, Portugal, and Greece. The only problem is that the bailout fund is not enough to bail out Spain, and the whole thing is coming down in flames.
Yanis, I think you may have come up with a fantastic term there, the Ponzi austerity, because in a traditional Ponzi scheme, new money is coming in to pay off the original members of the pyramid scheme. But in this European reverse Ponzi scheme or a Ponzi austerity scheme, it's not new money that's coming in, but new debt at ever higher interest rates. So it's a downward spiral of debt, a Ponzi debt scheme in reverse that's guaranteeing, without a question of a doubt, what you say is the workhouse, I call the whorehouse, but it's inevitable through a Ponzi scheme. It's a negative pyramid scheme of ever imploding debt, yes?
Absolutely. Look, it's very simple. Austerity is supposed to be belt tightening, that is reducing the amount of money that you're utilizing in order to keep your system going, whether your system is a household, a firm, or a state. Now, austerity could never work in the Eurozone, given the way that its architecture worked. So we didn't have austerity. We had what I call Ponzi austerity, because on the one hand, you're squeezing, utilizing the ideology of belt tightening and austerity, taxpayers into a kind of state that is completely unsustainable. Effectively, you are killing all economic life within Europe. You're creating a major recession by screwing people right down to the ground, while at the same time you are creating huge quantities of money that is being bandied about between states and banks, but in an unsustainable way. That's why I call it this Ponzi austerity.
Right. So I want to emphasize this. So in the case of Greece, and now in the case of Spain, what the governments are asking the people to do is to accept two things: austerity and more debt. The people in these countries believe that they're accepting austerity in the belief that they will have their debt reduced. Well, this is completely false. As you point out on your blog and in your writings, they are being asked to accept austerity plus more debt. Now, in the case of Spain bailout, will it be like Greece? I think we've said it will be. So I'm going to move on to this question. On to this 4.2 billion euro loan Greece has recently forced to take from the EFSF. This is a perfect example of your schema of a Ponzi austerity. Who exactly forced Greece to take the loan? Was it in the interim government that accepted the loan? Who profited from the loan? So go into greater detail on the Ponzi austerity reverse Ponzi scheme as it relates to Greece and the EFSF loan.
You will recall that last November we had a supposed technocrat being installed as prime minister, an unelected prime minister of Greece, Mr. Papadimos, one of the worst central bankers in the world, given that together with Mr. Trichet increased interest rates a month before Lehman Brothers went down in flames. Now, this gentleman, Mr. Papadimos, who happens to be a colleague of mine at the University of Athens, effectively presided over the negotiations that led Greece to signing the second memorandum of understanding, the second bailout with the Troika. As part of that second memorandum that Mr. Papadimos presided over, Greece was committed to a series of three things: loan installments that it would receive from the Troika, payments that it would make to the Troika from those loans, and thirdly, austerity measures that is screwing the population into the ground. The Greek government has been the interim government, that technocratic, supposedly, government that was reliant on the parliamentary support of the major parties, corrupt parties in Greece, the socialists and the conservatives, saw through this deal completely. So the Greek government did its part of the deal. Now, let me mention that particular payment that you mentioned too. 2.5 weeks ago, according to that schedule of loans and repayments, Greece was going to receive 5.2 billion euros from the FSF, of which 5.2 billion it would be able to keep 1 billion for the use by the Greek state for buying pharmaceuticals for hospitals and paying for schools and pensions and stuff, 1 out of 5.2, and 4.2 would go back to the European Central Bank, and I'll explain why that was part of the deal. Now, the Troika, interestingly, broke that agreement. So the 1 billion that was going to go to the Greek state never reached the Greek state. So of the 5.2, only 4.2 went to Greece, but not to Greece, because Greece had to pay every single euro of the 4.2 billion to the European Central Bank. Now, why? Why to the ECB? The ECB, in its wisdom, if you recall, a year and a half ago, entered the secondary bond market and bought stressed bonds of Greece, Ireland, and so on, supposedly to prop them up. That failed, of course. Nevertheless, it ended up with billions of worth of Greek government bonds in its books. Now, in March, those bonds, for all other bondholders, were haircut savagely, not the ECB's. So the ECB wanted to take its money back, to have its bonds, Greek government bonds, redeemed. And it had them redeemed at face value, even though the ECB never bought them at face value. They bought them at 20 or 30% discount, which means that the Greek government, and that's how I finalize the whole thing, 2.5 weeks, borrowed 4.2 billion from one arm of the European Union, from the FSF, in order to give it wholesale to the ECB, so that the ECB could profit from the bankruptcy of the Greek state, while the Greek population was being screwed to the ground. That is Ponzi austerity.
Okay, so you have the population being forced to accept austerity, plus more debt at the same time, plus the specter of the people who are perpetrating this Ponzi scheme enriching themselves with billions of dollars by manufacturing and selling and constructing this Ponzi austerity scheme. And there's an election coming up in Greece in a few days. Yanis, the new government, what's the first thing they should do? Day one, whoever gets into office, what should they do?
One thing, announce that Greece is not going to accept the next loan installment from the Troika. Look into the eyes of the German taxpayer and say, you are backstopping these loans to us. Those loans are not helping us restore our economic activity, our society, keep our hospitals running. Those loans we have to take unsustainably and give them back to the ECB or to some other creditor. Now, we are not going to be able to keep doing this because we are sort of collapsing and imploding. So your good money is going to be thrown after bad money, and in all consciousness and on the basis of just simple solidarity of one European to another, we, the Greek taxpayers, the Greek government, are looking at you, the German taxpayer, and saying, we are not going to accept this money. And if this means we're going to go bankrupt, well, so be it, because we are bankrupt. We have to find another way of making this Eurozone of ours work, or let it just go to hell.
All right, Yanis Varoufakis, we're out of time. Thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Welcome to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Long-standing data patterns have broken down. Stock prices have soared even as bond spreads have declined. Corporate bond yields are falling while debt is rising. Yes, down is the new up, while ironically up is the new down. So the pilots of the global economy and financial markets don't know if they're flying upside down or right side up, ascending or descending, soaring or crashing. Stacy?
Yes, Max. This seems to be the problem we have with the global financial system and markets at the time, is that you have the likes of Paul Krugman on one side saying everything is going great. Then you have the likes of Bill Gross at PIMCO on the other side saying this is a dangerous market. So we're going to look at some headlines here about who is right. Markets Insight, phony QE piece masks rising risk of instability. So Gillian Tett asks, are the markets going mad? Between 1997 and 2001, the level of unemployment in the Eurozone was always inversely correlated to the stocks index. However, as you can see from this chart, since 2011, the Eurozone jobless rate has jumped from 10 to 12%, even as the stocks has risen 10%. So you can see from that chart that they've gone in separate directions. The light blue line is the unemployment number inverted, and the red line is the stock equities index.
Well, the economy has entered the Bermuda Triangle. You know, the Bermuda Triangle, famously, where many planes have disappeared. What we know anecdotally about the Bermuda Triangle is that when the planes fly in there, the dials, the instruments, start spinning wildly in opposite directions, and the pilots get disoriented, and they disappear from the face of the earth. Now, here you have an economy run similarly, where the dials and gauges that are used to determine where the economy is, the unemployment numbers, the GDP numbers, the inflation numbers, the productivity numbers, the stock market, the bond market, the currency market, they're all showing conflicting signals, all showing conflicting data. They're all spinning in the opposite directions. You see, bond markets in particular are rising on a rising supply, goes completely against economic theory, economic reality of supply and demand, whereas gold and silver are dropping on all-time high demand. Again, the Bermuda Triangle economy. Who's getting lost? Those people that are being asked to suffer austerity. They're disappearing. They're the casualties of this Bermuda Triangle economy.
Citigroup had asked, maybe unemployment no longer has any relevance. It has for 30, 40 years. Perhaps it doesn't, okay, because we are in a sort of neo-feudal system, the sort of bottom 99%, maybe they don't matter anymore. Maybe they're not needed for a globalized economy. Maybe that's why we could split off. Or they ask, it no longer seems that earnings matter to the stock market either. Because if you look at this, you can see that U.S. earnings revisions have tracked swings in the stock market, usually back for decades, as you see in this chart. But since the start of 2012, there have been net downward earnings revisions, as you can see on the right of this chart, while U.S. stocks have soared. Again, perhaps the earnings of these companies have no bearing on where the stock prices go, apparently not to the investors, but as you see from the chart, they no longer matter. Earnings no longer matter to the financial system.
Well, I'm a veteran of these markets now for almost 30 years. And over the years, different data is popularized in the financial press and by the big money managers on Wall Street. Sometimes they look at earnings. Sometimes they look at just the cash flow. Sometimes they look at asset values. You remember the bull market in the early 80s started with the really invention of the desktop spreadsheet and the ability to create leveraged buyout programs and financings right there. And this begot Drexel Burnham Lambert and Michael Milken, and you had the asset value was suddenly the private market value, as it was called, took precedence over PE or cash flow. So now we're in a market where, as you point out, PE, the E standing for earnings, is highly questionable. Why is that? Well, you know, it goes back to the big four accounting firms who supply the market with the data on the E that determines PE, and they've been involved in as many scandals as the banks, as the hedge funds, as the governments, those big four accounting firms. So I'm not surprised that people are wondering what the E stands for. Well, it's being supplied by the four remaining oligopolists and kleptocrats who were involved in the scandals leading up to this nightmare to begin with.
The Citigroup and Gillian Tett had looked at the earnings seem to have no relevance whatsoever, whether on the company earnings or the labor earnings on the stock market. They've gone in separate directions in the last 2 years. They've suddenly broken decades-long patterns. So then she looks at debt. So too with credit spreads and leverage rates. In the past 2 decades, spreads on investment-grade companies have always widened when corporate debt levels rose. But since 2011, the leverage ratio of Eurozone companies has risen from 1.4 times to 1.7 times, while spreads have declined from around 210 basis points towards 120 basis points. A similar pattern is at work at the U.S.
This is classic bubble propaganda, bubble thinking. If you look at the bubble, the housing bubble of the America in the 2005-2006 period, people were convinced that housing could only go up. They're not making any more land. It couldn't possibly go down. We've never had a synchronized coast-to-coast downturn, and of course that crashed. During the dot-com era of the late 90s, there was a new paradigm. Remember Alan Greenspan thought we had entered a new period of permanent productivity gains and that these stocks would never go down. Then there was an 80% crash in the NASDAQ. The 1987 stock market crash shortly before then. I was on Wall Street. We were selling portfolio insurance, which gave everyone the illusion that their portfolios could never lose more than 1 or 2% a year because it was insured. Well, that crashed. Now we're in a new bond bubble where people think that, oh, these bonds can only go up in price because governments will never end their quantitative easing, and the cross-ownership of all these sovereigns amongst each other, coordinated by the IMF and the World Bank and other global banking, will never end. And this is a new period of permanently low interest rates, and wages will never matter again. And this bubble that we've been talking about now for a year or so will crash and pop and burn just like all the previous bubbles. It's just difficult to know the exact date.
Yeah, so either the markets are crashing or they're soaring, because only one of those indicators can be right. They're supposed to be correlated. They're supposed to be, earnings and the share price are supposed to be related in some way. There has to be some sort of basis, a foundation to your economy for the stock market to reflect the foundation. So only one of those are right. But she's then asks why we're seeing so many indicators that don't make sense. She says it is easy to identify the reason for this. As this data has gone haywire in the last couple of years, Western central banks have been unleashing an estimated $7 trillion worth of quantitative easing. This has lowered interest rates on government bonds, forcing investors to search elsewhere for yield. But what has intensified the crunch is that while central banks have been gobbling up bonds, the supply of assets has declined.
Yeah, well, a lot of the assets are being retired through mergers and acquisitions. But I have been saying now for a couple of years that what will keep the bubble going longer than most people anticipate is that, yes, the central banks are buying back bonds. They're selling and buying the same bonds. It's a massive Ponzi scheme. And the Federal Reserve Bank's balance sheet has increased by trillions of dollars. The Bank of England's balance sheet has increased by trillions of pounds. But the ECB, the European Central Bank, which is essentially the Bundesbank, which is essentially Germany, their balance sheet has not expanded at the same rate as these other global banks. Theirs will. So they're really the buffer now. The Germans are the economic buffer that's absorbing all of this quantitative easing in a lot of ways and in the Eurozone. So number one, it means that the euro is not going to dissolve or disintegrate. Number two, it means that the bond bubble will continue up until the point of the ECB finally throwing in the towel, because that was the lender of last resort was the ECB. If they want to go over to an IMF-led special drawing right, recapitalization of the global economy with a $100 trillion debt facility, as was mentioned at Davos a couple of years ago, well, yeah, that's possible. But let's totally flame out and toast out and burn out the ECB.
They also mentioned that the volume of transactions is at multi-decade lows, and that it's what Citigroup refers to as stable hands are no longer holding on to these in the markets. They're not in the bond or equity markets. In fact, it's a lot of foreigners are buying, who are the least stable of all investors, because they have the currency risk and they often flee. They're the hot money that flees the markets quickly, whether it's the property markets, by the way, or the stock or bond markets. So we're kind of at stall speed in terms of there's lack of liquidity. And Citigroup says there's an entrance with no exits. So if you look at the mutual funds, that's a dark blue line, and that's rising, rising, rising. With the red line, that's the ETFs, including their ETF assets. And the dealer inventory is the light blue line. And as you see, Max, that's at all-time low. So explain to the audience what the significance of the low inventory by the dealers.
Well, there's an old saying on Wall Street, feed the ducks when they're quacking. Meaning that for these people that are buying into this market, they won't be able to exit their positions if there's nobody on the other side of that trade. It was easy to unload all this junky debt a year ago, 2 years ago, because the masses were quacking. They were saying, oh, I'm not getting any yield on my bank deposits. I'll buy any junk bond out there. I won't look at it. I'll buy it as a blind pool. I'll buy anything you throw at me as long as it has a 5% yield or a 2% yield. Quack, 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 quack. Okay, now the ducks are starting not to quack so much. You see the volume is drying up. When the bubble reaches its apex and when it pops, then it's time to sell. There'll be no bids because the ducks are not quacking anymore. So you have a vacuum on the sell side. So bonds within a day, well, as we've seen now every 5 or 6 years, I don't know why people are going to be surprised by this, whether it's the Asian financial crisis, the dot-com crisis, the housing bubble crisis, bonds will be no bid. We saw it in 94. The bond market in 94 was a crash. We're going to see another 94. And Bill Gross at PIMCO says the same thing. This looks like 1994 all over again. So you have a crash. Yields then double. But because these countries are so indebted, their interest cost double. Now in America, they're already paying 15% to 20% of their taxes to pay interest on debt. And now they're issuing bonds just to pay interest on their debt. That's called hyperinflation.
So you mentioned the low volume. We've discussed that. And the Citigroup mentions that it's retail investors who are long in this market right now. The pros are out because they're not fighting the Fed. Nobody wants to fight the Fed. These investors like Bill Gross see these discrepancies and that this is a wild market, that the Fed will slaughter anybody in there who dares to go against them. So, my theory, though, is if you're on this plane and you need these instruments to tell you where you're flying, the Fed is basically has hijacked the global economy with the equivalent of a box cutter. It's this flimsy little device called quantitative easing. And the two people fighting the Feds, the two investors, are Bitcoin and gold. And they even refer to this gold towards the end of the Citigroup thing of what do you do? They say gold suddenly not so precious. And as you see, as we know, the price has been falling. But again, none of these indicators are right. So one side of these indicators is wrong. So is it the gold or is it the dollar? Which one is signaling the wrong story about the global economy and financial markets?
Yeah, well, are you going to believe people selling counterfeit paper claims on derivatives that are tied to a theoretical presence of gold, that is the ETF market and the futures market and the COMEX market and the London Bullion Markets Association market that's leveraged more than 100 to 1? Or are you going to believe millions and millions of people around the world clamoring and queuing up to buy physical gold and silver? That's the choice. Do you choose reality or do you choose the phantom? Into all of this, we see Bitcoin and the Bitcoin vigilantes, of which I am one. I am a Bitcoin vigilante. The bond vigilantes are dead. The gold and silver vigilantes are in a coma. But the Bitcoin vigilantes are now here on the scene, ready to do battle against the fraudsters. All right, Stacy, that's all the time we have. Thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max. Very much on the cards as the realization dawns that the British currency does not deserve to be on a premium compared with the dollar or the euro. We said that here, of course, first. You and Jim Rickards have said that. Jim Rogers also said that on the show long ago. But we're also coming to the uncomfortable realization here, the awkward moment, that this country is led economically by someone who's dumber than a slime mold. I'm sorry.
Well, Osborne is really leading the UK economy into the gutter. And the reliance on the City of London to generate some kind of GDP growth is also being challenged by the move from the pendulum or the center of gravity swinging from the UK as a financial center to Frankfurt, because the euro is emerging as a much more stable currency than the pound.
So he keeps on pushing inflation as the solution, and it loses every time. It doesn't help anybody. And we can see that the most important chart in British politics. So this is following on Simon Rosenberg's the North Star of Obama's policy, the most important chart in American politics, which is, if you look at this chart, the same in the UK, the same in the US, and that is that household incomes have lagged behind GDP and productivity growth. So here's your inflation for you. All the GDP growth is inflation, and it's going to the financial pushers. So the dark blue line on the bottom is median household income, and that's barely risen in 10 years, as you can see. Red line is output per worker, soaring. Light blue at the top is GDP per person. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see this is what's causing a lot of the strife, the inability for people to service their debts, because they're not capturing any of the gains in the economy. The inflation, the benefits of inflation are going to the very top.
For apocalypse and the emergence of a neo-feudal system.
So going back to that chart there, one participant in a recent focus group organized by the think tank Policy Exchange explained her situation as this: my income doesn't allow ... You know, you go shopping and you're trying to cut your costs, but your ends don't meet anymore. I found over the last 12 to 18 months, I'm increasing my overdraft to make ends meet. When's it going to stop? I can't keep doing this.
Yes, the UK household budget, 25% is allotted to transport because the prices for transportation, rail systems, and gasoline are skyrocketing, and that is set to increase even more dramatically. So, yes, the quality of life, standard of life in this country is deteriorating, and George Osborne is doubling down on the very policies to make it even worse. All right, Stacey Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
On the next episode of the Keiser Report, I'll be speaking about Iran hanging bankers. In the meantime, stay tuned for the second half of this episode, for the second half of my interview with a many-celled monetary scientist, Professor Antal Faketa. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm pleased to welcome back to the show Professor Antal Faketa of the New Austrian School. This time, the professor is here to talk about silver backwardation, manipulation, liberation, and also possibly about the Austrian School. Professor, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
All right, Professor, we talk a lot about J.P. Morgan's involvement in silver manipulation, and but your work is interesting in that you've gone back, you've written a piece going back to 1879 to 1935, the world witnessed a spectacular event, the collapse of the value of silver by more than 80%. Tell us about it.
This is really amazing how economic historians ignored that not just momentous, but a very decisive event, which is unprecedented in the whole history of civilization, namely the elimination of silver money altogether. And it took that long, from 1879 to 1935, to accomplish that. And as you say, 80% of the value of silver was wiped out. This is absolutely unprecedented, because it's not just value that was being wiped out, but also liquidity, because silver was money just as acceptable as gold was, and that completely disappeared. And all the economic historians assume that this was nature ordained, but it was manipulated.
Who was behind this?
This is a good question which would take a lot of research to find out. My guess,
yes,
whatever it is worth, is a conspiracy between government and the banking system, which was never really revealed. Very little is in the public domain. People just assume that there is such a conspiracy, but in fact nobody can prove it.
So by 1935, at the end of this collapse, there was no more silver standard anywhere in the world.
Yeah, because China, which had been on the silver standard since time immemorial, abandoned the silver standard in 1935. So we can just say that was the end of it. Silver was no longer money anywhere in the world.
Now, there was a bimetal standard, as I recall. William Jennings Bryan, he gave his famous speech not to be crucified on a cross of gold.
That's right.
And there was this idea between going back and forth between silver and gold, and there was that bimetal standard. And now both metals have been demonetized completely.
By now, but not by Bryan Jennings. He ran for presidency, I don't know, 3 times and failed every time. But what came out of it was the gold monometallism as opposed to bimetallism, and it was deflationary as charged by people like Keynes and Friedman and others. But the reason was because they removed silver, you see,
right,
which meant a big contraction.
Okay, so let's flash forward to today when people say there's not enough gold or gold is impractical as a monetary metal. They forget the fact that there was a bimetal standard, there was silver, people were on a silver standard, and it worked great for decades.
Oh, for millennia.
Now let me ask you this, because our friend Hugo Salinas Price in Mexico, he's been flying around the world trying to get countries to bring back silver or to monetize silver in places like Athens, and he's trying to do it in Mexico. So he's really the last vestige of this integrity in terms of metal. You're familiar with his campaign, and do you think he'll ever be successful with that?
Yes, yes. But you see, bimetallism is a defective system because it fixes the gold-silver ratio. What the world really needs is a system with 2 monetary metals, but not a fixed ratio. The ratio would stabilize, in my opinion, once you put that into practice, but it should not be legally fixed, the ratio, and that is what the trouble was.
Right, so you have a bimetal exchange, or you have a metal standard. There is a thing called the market. The market can interact with the monetary metal, and you can have an economy where there's a reference point is based on something of intrinsic value. But once you bring bankers into the equation, once you bring derivatives, once you bring central planning, once you bring a fixed rate of exchange between these 2 metals, things tend to go haywire,
yes,
and then they blame the metals. They don't blame
That's
themselves
right.
for their own wanting to rig the market. Now, I wanted to bring us to market rigging as a topic, because you've written extensively about the bond market, and you wrote a piece recently, or a couple of years ago, front-running the Fed in the Treasury market. And the reason this is important is because people say that the Fed is printing lots of money, they're buying lots of bonds through quantitative easing, they're printing lots of money, but they don't see the inflation of all of this. But in the most high-profile case being Paul Krugman of the New York Times. But you have done a little bit deeper thinking on this and kind of are able to give us the full picture. To explain a little bit about front-running and why this has obscured the inflation debate.
Yes. This is the most amazing thing to me, to my mind, in the history of science, that nobody, but nobody, save yours truly, pointed out that the idea of Keynes, when he proposed that it's just a matter of printing the bonds and selling them, that would take care of all the monetary problems. You see, once you introduce what they call open market operations, which is the central bank going to the open market and buying the bonds, the government bonds, from the banks, from ordinary people, from savings banks, from pension funds, and so on. This has a side effect which is absolutely devastating. And this is bond speculation. That's the side effect. Because the bond speculators are not stupid. They know that the central bank is doing that. So they are going to prevent the central. They want to pocket free, risk-free profits. And they do. And so this whole edifice of Keynesian economics collapses on the problem of speculation.
Let me ask you this, because during the 1980s, when Bill Clinton was president, there were a group of folks in the markets called the bond vigilantes.
Yeah,
and
but that goes back to the 19th century.
So if the government was going to be fiscally imprudent, the vigilantes would sell off the bond market, and this would somehow force the government to be more prudent because interest rates would go up. But what we've seen with these programs of quantitative easing is the bond vigilantes have been neutralized. They've been taken out of the picture because the government themselves are both the seller of the bonds and the biggest buyer of their own bonds. So they have destroyed the price signal. And the inflation that should be appearing more obviously is showing up in what would be an historic, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like the bond bubble, the sovereign bond bubble in the US and the UK, and we can call it a bubble, is an historic bubble. And when that finally does burst, like all bubbles do, we'll see that inflation, but it'll come all of a sudden.
And at the very, very end. But in the meantime, I wouldn't like to confuse a bond vigilante and a bond speculator. A bond vigilante is like it's a popular movement. But the bond speculators they are specialists, they are experts, they are very, very sharp.
I understand your point between the vigilante and the speculator. The speculator is this breed of the past 10 or 15 years with 0% interest rates that has created this enormous bond bubble. Price discovery has been destroyed, and the tsunami of this inflationary cash will come into the market at some point, but it'll happen quite quickly. It's all, as a matter of fact, I believe this has all been foretold in something called the Austrian School of Economics.
Yes.
Right? I mean, so let's talk about the Austrian School, but I want to be very specific about the Austrian School of Economics question, because this is kind of the fundamental difference between Karl Menger, who is the founder of Austrian School, and Ludwig von Mises, the economist with whom most American Austrians would be familiar. So I set you up with A, the bond bubble collapse was foretold in Austrian School, but B, what's the difference between Menger and Ludwig von Mises?
Well, to put it simply, Menger did not believe in the quantity theory of money, which is just a model, which is just a tool, if you like, to help understand. But Mises is a professed quantity theorist. And he said, well, it has to be refined, it has to be modified a little, but basically it's the right idea. There is an equilibrium price. Menger says, no, the markets create this equilibrium. And there are two prices, bid and offer. And no unified single price, monolithic, forget it.
But isn't it, Menger it leans more on this thing called subjectivity, whereas the Mises is trying to quantify what Menger would say is subjective. Isn't there a bit of an attempt to quantify something that Menger is saying is unquantifiable and ineffable?
Absolutely. Mises,
that's my point. I want to make that. That's my point to all the people out there, the trolls that have been trolling me. Continue, please.
Mises is known as the greatest champion against positivism. But in fact, when it comes to the quantity theory of money, he becomes a positivist himself, because he is ignoring the subjective and concentrating on the objective.
That's what I say.
And to make that point is a cardinal sin. It brings excommunication. Look at me. I am the living example. I've been excommunicated from the Austrian family, the School of Economics. So I had to call myself New Austrian School of Economics.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, there's only one school of Austrian economics, and that's the New School of Austrian Economics. All right, Professor, thanks so much for, you come by anytime, but we're out of time. We'll have to say goodbye, and thanks so much for being on the show.
Well, thank you very much. It was a great pleasure. Let's continue.
Excellent. All right, and that's all the time we have for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Professor Fiketa of FiketaResearch.com. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go down under to Australia and speak with Satyajit Das, author of Extreme Money. Das, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Nice to be with you, Max.
All right, Das, let's talk 2013. What do you see as the key economic themes for the new year?
Well, the first theme, I think, is this is the year in which people are going to realize that economic growth ain't coming back. Because I think for the last few years, everybody said, well, we tried this, it didn't work. Oh, no, we've got a new thing, it'll work. And I think people will suddenly realize that growth is not coming back at the levels we saw, say, pre-2007. The second thing which will flow from that, I think, is that people will focus more intensely on the policy tools, which is fiscal policy, the monetary policy, which is zero interest rates. As you know, we might have negative interest rates, and also all the money printing, the quantitative easing. People will start to ask questions like, does this stuff actually work? And if so, when will it work?
All right, so Das, let me cut in for a second, because you said the key theme here in 2013 will be lack of growth. Now, what we've seen in the past is that policymakers, when faced with lack of growth, they change the definition of growth. For example, they'll change how to calculate GDP. They'll change how to calculate CPI. Now we have a new central banker coming in to England. His name is Mark Carney. They're bringing him over from Canada. He's talking about nominal GDP growth. Isn't that just basically more of this shuffling around definitions to hide the fact that the economies are in free fall? Your thoughts?
Absolutely. I think we're going to change that. I mean, the French are experimenting with gross national happiness. So if you live in France and, you know, if you could include things like the amount of garlic in your food and the beauty of women and the sort of length of skirts, their GDP would be just monstrous. So people will change all the definitions around. You're absolutely correct. The most funny one of that was Argentina. In Argentina, when inflation went through the roof, they decided basically to exclude anything which was going up too fast on the basis that nobody could afford it anyway. So I think we'll see a lot of that. You're absolutely correct. And I think that's going to be a theme of more lies, more hypocrisy, more manipulation on the part of politicians, because we all know without delivering prosperity, they'll have trouble getting re-elected. It's just simple as that.
All right, Das, you're a smart fella. I've got my own theory that I would like to present to you to get your thoughts on it. I call it the zombie economics, and it works like this. There are those in the economy who have access to money at 0%. So every time prices go up, they simply dig deeper into their 0% infinite credit line, so they never feel it. Those who have to pay 3% or 6% or 16% or 30% or a payday loan at 400%, they actually feel it when prices go up. Therefore, the central banks are talking about deflation, but they're talking to people whose cost of money is zero and who have an infinite credit line. They live in a parallel world, correct?
Absolutely. I mean, the classic one is in Japan. If you actually look at Japan, that the phrase zombie economics actually comes from Japan, because after the Bank of Japan started to flood the system with money, print money, had zero interest rates, what we saw was exactly what you're describing, except that the fact financial assets didn't go up in price in Japan. But in terms of the real economy, what we saw was that businesses, because they could keep their loans in place, didn't sell damnly bad assets. They didn't do anything. They didn't do any of the steps necessary. And effectively what the zero interest rates do is it's a massive transfer of wealth. So if you've saved money, if you've been a good boy or a good girl and done all the things that you were taught to do, thrift and all of that sort of stuff, you basically now pay the costs of all the people who've borrowed, who more importantly, as you correctly say, will keep borrowing. I mean, Bernanke last year, people missed this at just one of his press conferences, admitted that quantitative easing has very little impact on the real economy. What he's trying to do is boost financial asset prices. And read from that, he's trying to help out the financial sector. I mean, basically, the world is one gigantic carry trade with zero interest costs. And that's what we're seeing. And the poor guys who've saved are going to get killed. But, at the end of it, we have to remember a simple truth. People have made bad loans. And the bad loans are result in one of two ways. You either write them down, or you pretend not to write them down and stretch them out. We're just stretching it out, and the people paying it are the savers. And that's the tragedy. And I wonder how long the rentier, the middle class, whose savings are being wiped out, will start to protest, not to mention the other group, which are the people who don't have jobs, the 25% or 27% in Spain, the 20% in Greece, the 15% in places like Portugal and Ireland. When are they going to take to the streets and basically tear some buildings down? I think that's the key issues going forward.
Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to the United Kingdom and talk with John Aziz of Azizonomics.com. John Aziz, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Fantastic to be with you, Max.
All right, John Aziz, there was no LIBOR manipulation crime. There was no subprime CDO crime. So why is everyone so upset with the bankers?
Everyone's upset with the bankers because since the year 1971, the bankers have got much, 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 much richer, and everyone else has got much, much, much poorer. As a percentage of GDP, corporate profits and the financial sector profits have shot through the roof in those years, and wages have shot through the floor. I think the biggest problem with the financial sector is the level of disparity between them and everyone else.
Right. Well, you mentioned 1971, of course. That's when Nixon closed the gold window. We embarked on this global experiment of fiat currencies. All the world's currencies refer to each other. There's nothing collateralizing any of this currency of any substance. And now we're into a weird phase, John, where the bankers are trying to come back with arguments that they don't have any actual collateral on their books, but they have flow. They have deal flow, and somehow this is their collateral. Your thoughts?
They have rehypothecation. If you have a very, very tiny pool of assets and you're just rehypothecating and rehypothecating and rehypothecating them, then it's going to look like you have a big economy. But if ultimately you're not producing much, and if ultimately people's wages are going down, and ultimately if people are getting poorer, then the financial sector's failing. I mean, the key to all of this is the financial sector does not produce anything. What it does is it kind of reallocates capital and resources, and that's what ultimately we have in the West. Since 1971, they've been set free to rehypothecate and to reallocate resources based on their preferences, and ultimately it's not really working out for the wider society. It's working very well for them because their wages and their profits and their bonuses are going up. Tyler from Zero Hedge showed me a graph, and it showed very clearly that as the level of leverage goes up, it's correlated very, very strongly with the level of bankers' bonuses. And that's what we're getting. The bankers are operating for themselves. They're looting and pillaging, and they're not going to stop until they're stopped.
All right, now, John, we had another banking scandal last week with Standard Chartered. They're they're being looked into now as part of a money laundering scheme. And the response from the UK, from Boris Johnson, from folks in the city, is that the US is taking a very anti-British approach to this, that they are calling the kettle black, that they're not looking at their own backyard on Wall Street. But the fact remains, John Aziz, and I'm curious what you think about this, AIG, Lehman Brothers, MF Global, the London Whale, Barclays LIBOR, HSBC money laundering, Standard Charter, they all went through London, and it all touches on something you've been talking about here, rehypothecation, because only in London do you have infinite rehypothecation. That is to say, you can sell the same security an infinite number of times with no collateral, correct?
And that's the problem. Glass-Steagall was repealed because the US banks felt like they couldn't compete with London, where you had infinite rehypothecation. So I think there is something sick at the heart of the city, and I think that thing is the ability to multiply up a tiny base of collateral to whatever level you want. I think that's absolutely connected with all of these scandals.
Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to Scotland to speak with Ian Fraser of ianfraser.org. Ian is a journalist, blogger, broadcaster who has made documentaries for the BBC about the financial collapse, including RBS, inside the bank that ran out of money. Ian Fraser, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Hi, Max.
All right. Ian Fraser, the rigging of LIBOR rates was first mentioned in the media as early as 2007. So why has it now only become the scandal that it is? And how high up the ladder does this crime story go?
Well, I think one of the main reasons is that we have, a very weak regulatory regime here in the UK, but it's not just the UK, it's obviously other countries as well. There was a kind of complicity between the financial regulator, the FSA, and the Bank of England and the banks, seemingly. I don't know quite when that element of it started, but it probably didn't start till the height of the crisis in about September 2008. But certainly, it was well known. In fact, there's a guy called Tim Bond who used to work for Barclays Capital, who went on Bloomberg Television in May 2008, and he publicly stated that there was a deep concern about these numbers and whether banks might be making them up. So you'd have thought, the FSA might have started to investigate at that point, but they didn't. The
pushback by the financial media, carried in the Financial Times, for example, is that, they committed crimes, but they saved the system from collapse. Is that a legitimate response?
Not in my view. I mean, I think, there's no excuse for committing crimes. And even if they are sanctioned by people like Paul Tucker, or if they were sanctioned by people like Paul Tucker, it doesn't excuse them in my view.
Right. I think the word for that in economics is moral hazard. And we've seen this play out over decades now, whether it's long-term capital management being bailed out by the Fed, whether it's the stock market being bailed out by Reagan and Greenspan in '87, or LIBOR supposedly bailing out corrupt banks in 2008. There doesn't seem to be any line in the sand over which these regulators won't forget about. The FSA, the Serious Fraud Office in the UK. The UK, of course, is where we had Lehman Brothers, AIG, Bernie Madoff, MF Global. Why is London such a crap regulator?
I think the rot really set in at Big Bang in '86 when Mrs. Thatcher's government deregulated the financial sector, and she demolished the silo-like structures and the partnerships that used to exist within the city. And in those days, I'm not saying it was totally clean, but it was less easy for conflicts of interest and corruption to occur. And there's various key dates that, as I see it, 1992 was a key date when there was the last ever criminal trial of high-level bankers from the City of London, which was the Blue Arrow trial. 3 senior executives of a bank called County NatWest were given suspended sentences for rigging a rights issue. And one stockbroker who helped them from UBS Phillips & Drew was also given a suspended sentence for rigging a rights issue. Now, the trouble was this didn't go down particularly well with the establishment, so they engineered a Court of Appeal case in July '92 where the sentences were quashed. And on the day of the quashing of the sentences, a friend of mine was phoned by a contact of his in the SFO, Serious Fraud Office, and the contact in the Serious Fraud Office basically said, the message has come down from on high. There will never again be a prosecution of a high-level banker or a mainstream city institution. So it would appear that from that moment on, there was a kind of new agenda had been set, whereby people in the city, and bankers in particular, were given carte blanche to do as they chose. This could include, false accounting, this could include defrauding their clients, could include money laundering. And it seems that a dangerous precedent was set at that moment. But the situation, if anything, got worse under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, when in 2000 they passed an act called the Financial Services and Markets Act 2000, which basically included a clause which said that the competitiveness of the city was more important than the rule of law. It said that regulators must consider the international mobility of the financial businesses before taking enforcement action, and they must avoid damaging the UK's competitiveness. So essentially they were kind of telling the FSA, the newly born FSA, that it should always consider whether or not financial institutions might move overseas before they prosecuted them. And I think this was serious. And then in 2002, you had another thing, which when Sarbanes-Oxley came in the US, it would appear that Gordon Brown and Tony Blair had a deliberate strategy of what's called a race to the bottom in the regulatory sense. I mean, I'm not saying that there was obviously regulation. There were loads and loads of regulation, but it's whether they were actually applied or not that mattered. But that the overall policy was not to properly apply the regulation that existed.
Right. Now, what's interesting in the last couple of weeks is that this LIBOR scandal at Barclays Bank, and including other banks around the world, is now entered into the Bank of England. So it's gone into the inner sanctum of the world central banks. Over in the U.S., of course, there's this audit the Fed movement that's been active for quite some time, a suspicion that the Federal Reserve Bank under Ben Bernanke has been committing acts of interest rate manipulation and fraud. But now Mervyn King is implicated in this. Do you think this will have, as some are speculating, a kind of a ratcheting up of the post 2008 crisis, leading to what some are calling the industry's tobacco moment, where the tobacco industry suddenly had to admit that their products were carcinogenic, and it changed the industry? Are we headed toward a moment where bankers have to admit that their fundamental business plan is toxic, they're a cancer, and the industry must change?
I sincerely hope so. I mean, I read that article in The Economist, and it was amazing to read that article, especially after their January article, which was called Save the City, which was really an abomination of an article. I was absolutely appalled by that piece. So the one they've just done, which mentions that quote of the tobacco moment, I agree with it, and I sincerely hope it is the tobacco moment. It's the moment where banks turn the corner. But, one's never that optimistic. You look at the precedents, and one does wonder whether or not they really are capable of reforming. And in terms of the complicity of the Bank of England and the UK Treasury and others, that has still to fully become apparent. But, it's difficult to know whether the Bank of England officially ordered the banks, including Barclays, to lie about their interbank borrowing rates, or whether or not they were maybe just kind of saying it would be okay if they lied about their interbank borrowing rates. But I suppose either is both of those are fairly unacceptable.
Yeah, now let's talk about the Royal Bank of Scotland, RBS, a bank you know well. It's the latest to be implicated in the LIBOR rigging crimes. The bank is mostly owned by the taxpayer. So why is the Treasury refusing to hand over documents relating to LIBOR rigging? And what will these documents show?
Okay, well, there's an inquiry underway in Canada, which is being led by the antitrust authority there, the competition authority in Canada. And the bank, Royal Bank of Scotland, is desperately trying to avoid handing over evidence to the Canadian regulators. And I think at the weekend, I know at the weekend that Vince Cable, who's the business secretary and is generally pretty, aware of the sort of things that banks get up to and wants to try and sort them out, he said that it was a no-brainer as far as RBS is concerned. They must just hand over this evidence. But it isn't just what's happening in Canada that matters. It's also what's happening in Singapore, because there's a trader there called Jimmy Tan, who was by far the bank's biggest earner in the Asia-Pacific region in 2009, earning about 80 million of the 160 million profit it earned in Tokyo, for example. And this guy is now being scapegoated, or it would appear that this guy, Jimmy Tan, is now being scapegoated by the Royal Bank of Scotland. And they're trying to accuse him of single-handedly manipulating the LIBOR numbers in order to to make profits for himself and for the bank, Whereas the truth would appear to be otherwise. It would appear that, in fact, he was given orders by people higher up in the bank.
Right, well, that's the what's going on here at the Bank of England, because up until now, the banks have pointed at the so-called rogue trader and the bad apple. But if Bank of England is authorizing this stuff, as it looks like they are, then we're talking about systemic crime syndicate infecting the entire system. Now, at the same time the LIBOR crime story was unfolding in the media, Ian Fraser, there was a less reported story of the swaps mis-selling. Tell us about the crime, which banks were involved.
Okay, well, that one involves every UK bank. The key players include Royal Bank of Scotland, HSBC, Barclays, Lloyds, and Clydesdale. I don't know about Santander, whether or not it was involved, but it probably was as well. Basically, what they did was they sold interest rate swaps to SMEs, which are small companies, many of which had no understanding of what it was they were buying. In fact, they were told it was something completely different. They didn't understand that if the interest rates fell, they could suffer huge costs, and they would have huge break clauses or break costs if they wanted to exit from these products. But it's basically one of the biggest scandals that's afflicted the UK banking sector certainly within the last couple of years. And it is literally destroying small businesses up and down the country on a virtually daily basis. And I've spoke to one this morning. He said that some of his friends are considering suicide. It's so serious. People are, not just losing their businesses, they're losing their homes. And it's just obscene. I mean, these products should never have been sold to these companies who had no idea what they were entering into.
All right, finally, Ian Fraser, people like to describe these crimes as victimless crimes. You just described a situation where people are either threatening to commit suicide, or we've seen instances of actual suicide going on. But the biggest loser in all this, of course, are the people who are the big losers when interest rates are manipulated down. And that, of course, would be the pensioner and the savers, who end up underwriting and subsidizing the speculators in the City of London. Why aren't the pensioners who, instead of getting 4 or 5% rate of return, which would be normally what they could anticipate in a non-fraudulent system, are getting only 0.5%? Why aren't they more vocal in demanding that they get their full return on their pensions instead of, a 90% discount to accommodate for the fraud?
I don't really know. I mean, I'm very surprised they're not being more vociferous, especially when you think so many pension schemes have lost out because of the LIBOR manipulation scandal. But I think one of the problems in the UK is the people often are just like, they grin and bear it. If things get bad, they just kind of think they should just shut up and accept this bad treatment that's being meted out to them by the Bank of England and the financial system. Maybe they will become more vociferous now, considering what's emerging. Well,
yeah, okay. Ian Fraser, are there, in this grand scope of things, are there any prosecutions at all? Was there anyone going to go to jail here? What's happening on that prosecutorial front?
It does seem as if the political mood changed on the 27th of June when the Barclays settlement was announced. It seemed that, the politicians finally woke up to the fact that some serious crimes have been committed by bankers. And so they did say, even David Cameron, even George Osborne, Ed Miliband and others suggested that criminal prosecutions should certainly be looked at. Personally, I'm not, holding my breath, but the SFO, the Serious Fraud Office, which is a pretty incompetent institution and has a history of failure when it comes to prosecuting high-level financial crime, is allegedly looking at it. So we'll have to see. But I mean, you have to prosecute these sorts of financial crimes, and you have to, if people are guilty of crimes on the level which have been unveiled in the Barclays report, then they should presumably go to jail. But I'm not holding my breath, to be honest.
Paul Moore, he's the former head of regulatory risk at Halifax Bank of Scotland, otherwise known as HBOS, before he became a whistleblower. Paul has put himself forward to serve as interim chairman of Barclays Bank while they go through the period of roughness there. Paul, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Thanks. It's difficult to think about banking when you're on a sunny beach in Spain.
Well, let's get into it. We'll try to pry some interesting information from you. So first, tell us about your role as a whistleblower at HBOS. What did the bank and what did regulators do upon receiving your information?
Well, it's a very simple story. I told the board that they should reconsider their strategy for sales growth if they wish to avoid risks to customers and colleagues. and the chief executive fired me. I asked for protection from the non-executives and the regulator, and I demanded an independent investigation. Well, nobody protected me, nobody listened.
Okay, so your former job was group regulatory risk. Does that basically mean your job was to make sure that the bank was not exposed to any regulatory oversight?
Absolutely not. I mean, I think that's part of the problem. The idea that people who lead internal control functions should seek to arbitrage all the regulatory requirements drives a coach and horses through the whole idea. In the UK, we have what's called an approved persons regime, which meant that I had a direct contract between myself and the regulators. It's not my job to do that. My job is to make sure that the bank is following the requirements within a reasonable margin. And it's a bit like a telemetrist or an engineer in a Formula One team. It's my job to help the car go around the track rapidly, but not so fast that it blows the engine up or crashes into the tire walls.
Right, but your role is that single point of failure between the banks and the regulatory obligations. You're the interface between those two things. You were unhappy with what you were seeing, you became a whistleblower. But essentially, my question is, there is a role at the bank where they have one foot at the bank, one foot really serving the regulatory interests, and this layer is corrupt in a big way, isn't it?
Well, it just doesn't work. Imagine if I'm reporting to the executive and they disagree with me and they have the power over my life or death, it's not going to work. So I've made very simple recommendations, which is control functions, that's risk, compliance, internal audit, should never report to the executive, should always report to the non-executive, and that there should be new policy around whistleblowing for those types of people that means they cannot be fired without a proper meeting of the non-executives, and that removal must be approved by the regulator. Otherwise, the system fails, as you said.
All right, now, Paul, what percentage of those working in regulatory oversight and compliance in the industry are clean? That is to say, they're not corrupt. When I was working on Wall Street, for example, at Payne Weber and Oppenheimer and Shearson, every year at Christmas time, I would bribe our compliance officer, as did every broker at these firms. There was known that the compliance officer was crooked. You give him a big enough Christmas bonus, and he overlooks margin requirement deficiencies. He overlooks fraud. He overlooks all the tricks of the trade. So what percentage of these guys that you were in that business are clean? They're actually doing the business in a clean way.
There's 2 points. The first is you have to have no professional qualifications to be a chief risk officer, a chief compliance officer, or a chief internal auditor. And so that's one thing. The second thing is if you report to the executive, well, hang on a second, you stick your head above the parapet and the messenger gets well and truly shot. So I don't know the answer to the question, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if it's quite a lot of people who are going to be prepared to oversee or miss things that they should cover. So the whole system doesn't work.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess from my experience, I never met in my many years on Wall Street a compliance officer that wasn't dirty. Now, since you blew the whistle, Paul, the entire banking system has gone into meltdown caused by the fraud that you warned about. Of this financial crisis, you said, quote, "The banking crisis isn't just about becoming poorer, it's about killing people. We never held anyone to account. We haven't done the radical reforming job we needed to do." Can you talk a little bit about that, Paul Moore?
Yeah, number one, everybody says and thinks the banking crisis is just about money. Well, money affects people's lives. The United Nations have estimated that the banking crisis drove 100 million people back into poverty around the world. The mortality statistics and morbidity statistic, that means the number of extra people who die and the number of extra people who are ill, rises dramatically when you're in poverty. And so I don't know the exact number, but I would be very surprised if the banking crisis didn't kill more people than any single conflict since the Second World War. So that's the first point. What was the second point you were asking me about?
Oh, well, you were talking about the banking crisis, in fact, part and parcel killing people.
Yeah.
We never held anyone to account, and we haven't done the radical reforming we need to do.
Well, I think The Inside Job, that fantastic film, demonstrated the point. Who's in charge of the democracies, the big democracies where financial services go on in the world? Well, it's certainly weapons, oil, financial services, pharmaceuticals, etc. It's not a democracy, it's a corporatocracy. So it's an inside job. We've got a situation in which we cannot get to the bottom of things because those with the vested interests in maintaining the status quo and avoiding their own accountability are in charge of everything. They've got the money. They fund the political parties. I know it's written into the US Constitution, private funding of political parties, but frankly, I think it creates a level of corruption that is very serious for the world. It's really just wrong. The vested interests have protected themselves from being held to account. They've protected themselves from a proper, detailed forensic investigation, and they've protected themselves from any proper reform. So it's just wrong.
All right, now you mentioned that this crisis has put 100 million people or more into poverty. Of that group, a certain percentage will die. You make this point very clear. Not since World War II have we had this type of purposeful ushering into poverty by a corpocracy, a kleptocracy, a kakistocracy, if you will. My point has been, and I want your thoughts on it, because a lot of people in the U.S. mainstream media portray this as a victimless crime. I have stated that it is creating millions of victims. And if you use the World War II comparison, Paul Moore, is it wrong to say that this is essentially a financial holocaust?
I think I love the words you use. Yes, that's a brilliant way of putting it, and I subscribe to that view. Just even if you haven't died, even if you haven't become very sick because you've been driven into poverty, your life has been made miserable by the austerity thrown upon you by bailing out the banks and making the rest of us pay for it. You're right, it's a corporatocracy, not a democracy, and we've got to do something about it. We're only going to do something about it if we build a mass movement of people, do some Martin Luther King-like non-violent resistance actions. We're in a right old muddle. That's what we'd say in England.
All right, now, Paul Moore, you say we need radical reform, but it's interesting. If you took away fraud, what would you have left? Wouldn't the UK banking system as we know it disappear? It's like a rusted out car. It has the shape of a car, but it's mostly rust. The UK banking system has the shape of a functioning banking system, but it's mostly fraud. If you took the fraud away, would there be anything left?
Well, there'd be what there should be. Look, it's not just investment banks that have manipulated markets through proprietary trading. It's retail banks that have time after time after time missold systemically to ordinary people things that they don't want, don't understand, and don't need. You can count dozens of times that they've done this. So what is a bank? Well, it's supposed to be boring, isn't it? It's not supposed to be kind of highly complicated. By the way, proprietary trading is tantamount to the manipulation of markets through a dominant position in information, generally derived from conflicts of interest, a dominant position in mathematical science, and a dominant position in computer science. And look, just last week we saw that company whose mathematics and computer science went wrong. It cost them a fortune. I can't remember their name now.
Knight Capital.
Yeah.
Well, when you talk about proprietary trading as having a dominant position, isn't that the same as saying that they have inside information?
Yes, it is. And you can liken this proprietary trading, which, by the way, isn't banking business. Think about it for a minute. What's it got to do with banking? I don't mind somebody investing in a hedge fund and taking risk with their own capital, so long as that hedge fund follows the rules. But what is proprietary trading got to do with banking? It's not got anything to do with banking. It's gambling. It's taking positions. Now, why can they make so much money out of it? Because they've got more information than anybody else. Where do they get it from? Generally from the inside in one way or the other. But they also use highly sophisticated mathematical models and highly sophisticated computer systems to do things, which means the rest of us cannot invest in the market properly. Now, they say, oh, well, hang on a second, it gives us liquidity. Well, hang on a second, we've got too much liquidity. And if you just think of shares and other financial instruments as I don't know, chips in a casino, well, frankly, it doesn't do any good for anybody. So it's essentially gambling in a rigged market, which they rig. Go and ask any day trader, read the Big Short. It explains exactly what happens. It's wrong.
Paul Moore, the bulk of the global financial scandal, whether it's AIG, MF Global, Lehman Brothers, the whale trade from JP Morgan, the list goes on, all goes through London. London apparently has the worst regulatory environment in the world. And of course, Blythe Masters of JP Morgan, the Wicked Witch of derivatives, also is based in London. London,
yes.
London itself, and also we learned from MF Global that unlike the United States, instead of being able to hypothecate or rehypothecate 140% of a security and for a lending requirement, you can rehypothecate to infinity in London. You can resell the same thing over and over and over again. What about this regulatory environment in London? When is the cesspool in London going to shut down?
Actually, if you look at the regulatory rules and the system, it's not bad at all. It's not that they didn't have the power, it's that they didn't enforce the rules. And we haven't invested in white-collar crime properly. You can steal a water bottle in a riot and get put in prison for 30 days. And David Cameron can, rant on about how bad they were. And yet you can missell anything from a bank and monetize your illegality and morality. We don't do enforcement properly. That's the problem. We don't enforce people. I've made this abundantly clear. We need to separate out the policy and rule setting and day-to-day supervision from investigation and enforcement, and we need to have a completely open and transparent tribunal. So these things, these wrongdoings, although they're called regulatory, are tantamount to criminal offences, and they should be held in public so that people like you can watch what they're doing and make sure that people are held to account, and that doesn't happen.
All right, Paul Moore, I'd love to continue, but we're out of time. I have to say goodbye. Thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
I've enjoyed it. Let's do it again.
Excellent. All right, that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. Hi, Max Keiser here. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. Time now to go to New York City and speak with Jim Rickards, author of this new book. It's called The Death of Money. Remember, Jim did the Currency Wars book, which became an instantaneous global sensation and bestseller. Now he's got the new one, The Death of Money. Jim Rickards, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
All right, let me read you a quote from your book. Quote, "It was the most blatant case of insider trading I have ever seen." This is a quote from the first chapter of your book. Tell us about it.
Well, the insider trading referred to in Chapter 1 of The Death of Money, Max, has to do with shorting airline stocks in advance of 9/11. So there was insider trading ahead of the 9/11 attack. It was very blatant, very clear. It was not picked up at the time. It was by some people in the market, I should say, but not by the intelligence authorities or any national security officials, but it was seen in the market. That quote that you read, by the way, comes from John Mulheron. John was actually tried and convicted of insider trading related to the 1980s cases in the early 90s. His conviction was overturned by the Court of Appeals. The Court of Appeals said the trial court got it right. He was totally exonerated, but I mention that only to say that here's a guy who knew about M&A, leaked information, insider trading, etc. He was one of the most famous stock traders on Wall Street, ran one of the largest specialists on the New York Stock Exchange. He was, at the time, the market maker in American Airlines stock. So hard to find anyone who knew more about trading, more about insider trading, market manipulation than John Mulheron. And that conversation took place actually at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. So it was part of an investigation. This all discussed in the book. There's a lot of academic evidence, there's forensic evidence, there's anecdotal evidence, but the case is overwhelming that there was insider trading ahead of 9/11.
All right, you mentioned this CIA headquarters and the fact that there was talk about insider trading ahead of 9/11 in the days leading up to the events of 9/11, particularly 4 days leading up to 9/11, looking at the forensic evidence and looking at markets as a way to aggregate lots and lots of data. And you talk about this in your book, the way that your team presents to the CIA a way of what you call market intelligence, or mark-ent, which is to use this very sensitive options market as a way to give a telltale sign of activity that's happening around the world and whether potentially this would flag a terrorist attack. So in the days leading up to the 9/11, in the options market, in those airline options, you have concluded without any equivocation that there was insider trading on those options leading up to the event, correct?
Well, that's my conclusion, Max, but it's not just my conclusion. As I mentioned, there are 3 major academic studies as well as other anecdotal evidence all pointing in the same direction. So to me, it's an open and shut case. It's all described in the book, which is heavily footnoted, I should say. So it's not just sort of wild speculation. I think it's very well documented. We take a look at the 9/11 Commission report, which reached a different conclusion, but I sort of deconstruct their famous footnote where they describe why they reached the conclusion and show what the flaws are in the footnote, what the flaws are in the forensic technique that the 9/11 Commission used. But your larger point that markets give us price signals, we know that, but how to look behind the price signal and understand exactly what's going on. By the way, this technique, which we explored for the CIA, is a completely normal technique used by hedge funds every day. Now, hedge funds are looking for insider trading around M&A deals. They're looking for a leak. You know, we see this all the time. A stock suddenly soars for no reason. There's no news. Maybe the market's flattened down, but a particular stock goes way up, and everyone said, gee, what's happening with that stock? And then 3 days later, we find out that it's the subject of a takeover that's announced, but clearly the takeovers don't come out of the thin air. They're, lawyers and accountants and experts and managers work on these things for weeks and sometimes months, and that's the inside group. But sometimes the information leaks out, people trade on it, and you see the price action ahead of the announcement. That's exactly what we saw in 9/11. There was massive, massive buying of put options, and of course when you buy a put option, that's a bet that the stock is going to go down. Massive buying of put options on American Airlines and United Airlines in the last several trading days ahead of 9/11. And again, that's been studied extensively, so I don't think there's any question that it was insider trading. I should add, however, that this was insider trading by terrorist associates. I want to be rigorous and scientific about the evidence, but sort of separate this from some of the crazy theories. There are crazy theories out there that, somehow the U.S. government was behind 9/11. That's all nonsense, and again, I want to separate myself from that. But the basic idea that the terrorists and their associates, that network, were engaged, who did know about the attack, were engaged in insider trading ahead of 9/11. That's very clear.
All right. Of course, when you trade options, you have to do it through a broker. We know from the investigative journalism of Lars Scholl, we know from statements from Deutsche Bank here in Europe, that these trades were done at Alex Brown, which is a firm not too far from the CIA, who was run by Buzzy Krongard. When I was working at Alex Brown, he was leading up the firm. He then took a job as the deputy director of the CIA under George Tenet during the events of 9/11. So here you have a firm in Baltimore where the trades were done that was run by the guy who's now the deputy director at the CIA. Your thoughts, your comments?
Well, Buzzy Krongard, former Alex Brown executive, was executive director of the CIA at the time. I haven't looked at all at the Alex Brown trading. To me, it's sort of irrelevant. What I look at is the market as a whole. What we were saying was really coming through the specialists. Now, you're exactly right, Max. I make the point in the book, nobody trades alone. If you're trading with somebody. So what I really focused on is the overall market action, not any particular firm, but could you tell from the price action and the volume and the momentum itself that something was going on at the time? And of course, we reached the conclusion that something was going on, which was obviously this 9/11 attack was about to happen. But I focus a lot on what's called signal amplification. And just to explain that for the viewers, you could have a very small terrorist trade, meaning, a few thousand shares. Well, someone sees that. It doesn't make the person who sees it a terrorist. They're just a specialist or a hedge fund or someone is kind of watching the tape, and they say, you know what, there's no reason for the stock to be going down. There's no reason for anyone to be buying puts. Someone knows something I don't, and they'll buy more puts. That then puts more pressure on the stock. There's more put buying. So by the end of the day, you may have millions of shares that have traded. It doesn't mean all those people are terrorists or insiders. That's actually legitimate trading. If you're watching the tape and you do what I call a piggyback trade on the original trade, that's actually not illegal. And all those people are not terrorists. Only the original trade, my example, a couple thousand shares would have been the terror trade. The rest of it is piggybacking or signal amplification. But this is where the 9/11 Commission fell down, because when they went back to investigate after the fact, they looked at the big guys. The big guys are invariably not the insider traders. They're not the terrorists. They're the guys piggybacking. You got to go all the way down to that small initial trade to find it. And that's what we did on a multi-year strategic study for the CIA. We basically explained how you could use that forensic technique, that market information, possibly to detect the next spectacular terrorist
Right, you talk
attack.
about signal amplification. When I was talking to Cantor Fitzgerald brokers and bankers in the days leading up to 9/11, they themselves were buying these airline puts. They told me, based on rumors that were coming out of Alex Brown associated with Buzzy Krongard. So this looks to me as if CIA insiders knew enough about what was going on, but chose to make money rather than blowing the whistle.
Well, I don't have any evidence of that, Max. The point I'm making is that you could have a lot of put buying in those stocks, particularly AMR and UAL, American Airlines and United Airlines. You could have a lot of put buying. In fact, there was a lot of put buying. That's clearly documented. I mean, we have the price information, we have the volume information, so we know what was actually transacted, and that's been studied very extensively. But the point I'm making is a lot of that put buying could have been people saying, hey, you know, something's going on. We don't know what it is. Why is everyone buying these puts? We're going to buy some more. We're going to make the same bet. We don't know why. You don't have to know why. All you have to know is that somebody knows something you don't. So the point I'm making is that a very small terrorist trade could have been amplified into a much larger market trade involving quite a few Wall Street firms. So again, it only takes a small amount of illegal trading or terrorist trading to be amplified and imitated and piggybacked in the market to a much larger volume. So again, I haven't looked at Cantor Fitzgerald or Alex Brown in particular. I've looked at the market as a whole, but the idea that a lot of people were buying puts based on the original signal,
Right,
that makes perfect sense.
and presumably somebody who was trading on their own demise was unable to collect the profits because some money was left over at Alex Brown and never collected, presumably from a banker who chose to take the money instead of running away and escaping with their lives. All right, let's move on.
A single mysterious computer program that placed orders and then subsequently canceled them made up 4% of all quote traffic in the U.S. stock market last week. Max, they say that the motive of the algorithm was unclear.
Yes, a mysterious algorithm was gobbling up the New York Stock Exchange and making a few people fabulously wealthy. A mysterious parasite called Jamie Dimon was swimming in the entrails of the lower intestines of the New York Stock Exchange, and he was getting fat on stealing money, along with Goldman Sachs and Barclays and who's this new guy in town? Martin Schlongflonger. Martin Schlinkflonger.
Martin Wheatley.
Martin Wheatley, here in the UK. He's a parasite crawling up the schwing of the alimentary canal of the banking system, engorging himself on the fraud. He's getting fat, Martin Wheatley, on the fraud. He's a parasite, Martin Wheatley.
Well, again, Max, the motive of the algorithm remains unclear.
There's nothing unclear about the motive of the algorithm. It's about stealing money. That's the way it's designed. That's the way it's written. They get all those Sharpies down there in the city and the Wall Street and MIT and Stanford University to create algorithms to steal money. That's not ambiguous. How can you say, oh, we just accidentally made money again? Every single day for 90 days in a row. We're reporting to the SEC we made money every single day, 90 days in a row. Accidentally. No, I accidentally found this wallet full of money in the same spot every single day for the last 90 days. That's not an accident. That's called stealing.
But I have these little images here. These are visits to maxkeiser.com from JP Morgan. Okay, first you see on 17th of August at 3:14 p.m., somebody from JP Morgan in New York visited maxkeiser.com. In specific, they visited a story on our site called "Are the Day Trading High Frequency Trading Algos Literally the Only Ones Left in the Silver Market?" After that visit from New York JP Morgan, we see a visit from London JP Morgan branch to that same story. So Max, why are they interested in a story called "Are the day trading HFT algos literally the only ones left in the silver market?"
Well, first of all, it's easy to track what JP Morgan's doing. So to front run what they're doing, of course, is our primary source of enjoyment. And so they're front running the dumb money on the floor. We're front running them by tracking their emails. So, you know, it all works out in the wash. But yeah, I mean, of course, they've got a global scam going, and the London Blythe Masters is the headquarters for their entire evil empire of high-frequency trading fraud and silver manipulation. But their day is coming, as I've said, Enron and WorldCom and JP Morgan going to zero as night follows day. There's no doubt about it.
So this piece on our site was written by Silver Doctor, and he was saying in the first 3 days of this week, which was the week August 16th, if these are any indication, the HFT algo day trading bots are literally the only traders left in the silver futures markets. Monday's price action is the light blue line, that's August 13th. Tuesdays is the red line, August 15th, and Wednesdays is the green line, August 16th. Notice how despite ranging intraday from 28.20 to 27.48 and big moves in between, precisely on the COMEX open each day, price has converged to exactly 27.83 at the Globex close every single day this week. So Silver Doctors is saying either this is a sign of manipulation or it's just high frequency traders in the market. It's just algorithms.
It confirms exactly what I've been saying is the nature of this manipulation is you pick the price first and then fill in the trades to get to that price. In a normal market, the trades happen first, and based on price discovery, it results in a price. But under this manipulation, and this illustrates this manipulation quite clearly, is that the bank, JP Morgan, they have a price that they want to get to, and they program the computers to fill in the trades to get to that price. And since they know what the price is going to be in the future, then they can do all kinds of side bets and manipulation to profit from their insider trading. And that's how they can report 3 months, 4 months, 5 months straight every single day, making profitable trades on their prop desks. Wink, wink, they're illegal, but they still continue because they know where the price is going to end at the end of the day. They manipulate around that. They use high-frequency trading and algorithmic trading to fill in the trades to get to the price that they've already predetermined. That's why this isn't a free market capitalist system anymore. It's a complete price rigging, manipulated scandal.
It amazes me that anyone ever lends them any money because you know you're never going to get repaid. This particular default, as I understand it, actually started some time ago. And the reason that it's happened the way it is from previous experience, the Argentinians had to go and have something under New York law, not under their own Argentinian law, so that they were bound, if you like, by international law. Now, that's terribly important. The reason that happened was because nobody would otherwise trust Argentina when it came to lending the money. So it goes wrong. The New York court then adjudicates on the matter, and Argentina walks away from it and saying, oh, they're horrid capitalists and they're nasty hedge funds and all the rest of it. I'm sorry they got themselves into this mess. It's as simple as that.
You say, why would anyone lend Argentina money? But we know that banks lend people money knowing they're not going to get paid back because banks are not taking those risks. They are hedged, and if there's a problem, they get the state to bail them out. So whether it's subprime mortgages, Argentina, or some unproven dot-com stocks back in the 90s, banks don't take risk making loans. So therefore, why wouldn't they lend to Argentina? They got paid, the bankers made their money, and they ran away. So why not?
But you're absolutely right.
At what point are the needs of the population taken into consideration? It doesn't seem that there is any point when those needs are taken into consideration. But I want to focus on a point you just made about these sovereign debt bonds. France, Spain, they're trading at 100-year, 200-year, 300-year lows on the yield. That would mean a high on the price. And yet we know these economies are not, recovered in any sense of the word. There's still this huge global financial crisis.
Well, worse than Max, we know that these governments never intend to repay the money.
Okay, so who's buying those bonds?
Well, basically, it's banks, it's sovereign wealth funds, it's central banks.
Why are they buying those bonds?
All that sort of very, very big institutional money. Some of it on the fringes, like pension fund money, is buying it on the basis that there's the Draghi put.
Meaning that the European Central Bank is going to buy these bonds or lower interest rates or make money available to make it a again, no risk.
Whatever it takes. in Mr. Draghi's words. And, you know, it's a ridiculous situation. So
how is this different than a Ponzi scheme? In other words, here you have sovereign debt that's used as collateral for derivatives, essentially. And because the derivatives market is growing by leaps and bounds, and because that is a proven Ponzi scheme, it seems that those who are financing the Ponzi scheme, who need even a 1% yield on a European government 10-year note, are willing to pay up for it as a way to broaden the base of what is essentially a global sovereign bond Ponzi scheme. Yes or no?
A Ponzi scheme is something that happens in the private sector and is illegal. The same thing can happen in the government sector and is not illegal. That is the only difference.
Fair enough.
So, you know, there's no point in adding to it, but that's basically it.
Okay, so you have a global sovereign bond Ponzi scheme driven by central banks who are keeping rates artificially low. In this country, in the United Kingdom, they talk about a recovery, and yet they keep interest rates at 0.5%. So how does that work? Who's lying if somebody's lying?
Well, because what they're then trying to do is they're trying to manage the currency. I mean, whether they raise interest rates a 0.25%, 0.5%, actually is not all that material. But it is the perceptions in the foreign exchange markets and how that affects the currency. That is the thing that matters as far as the central bank is concerned, the Bank of England. And what they don't want to do is to have sterling going up and have us priced out of the market. I mean, I know this is Keynesian rubbish, but that's basically the way they think.
But there is no recovery if they're not raising interest rates, because if there was, they would be raising interest rates.
It is completely false. Exactly. And not
so in other words,
that,
to answer the question, who's lying, the answer is George Osborne. I want to get to gold because, of course, goldmoney.com is where you hang your hat these days. And you are one of the foremost experts on gold in the world. Alistair, is that a fair statement? I'll say that.
I hope it
is. Just to be nice, you know. So the gold market is going through a radical change. So tell us about it.
It's going through a radical change in London. If you go back to Big Bang, which was 30 years ago in the mid-80s, there was a decision taken as to what was a regulated investment and what wasn't. Physical metals were excluded from regulation. The result is that the London bullion market has grown up as an over-the-counter market. It has developed beyond anyone's wildest dreams, but it is a market which, if you like, is stuck in the 1980s in terms of the information it provides to people. And meanwhile, other markets, particularly China, have evolved. They're doing very, very big business, physical business, and not only that, but the level of information they give out to people. If you go back to Big Bang, which was 30 years ago in the mid-80s, there was a decision taken as to what was a regulated investment and what wasn't. Physical metals were excluded from regulation. The result is that the London bullion market has grown up as an over-the-counter market. It has developed beyond anyone's wildest dreams, but it is a market which, if you like, is stuck in the 1980s in terms of the information it provides to people. And meanwhile, other markets, particularly China, have evolved. They're doing very, very big business, physical business, and not only that, but the level of information they give out to people who want to participate in that market is enormous compared with the very limited smoke and mirrors information
London
that comes
sets
out
the
of
price
London.
with the daily fixing. And
well,
that London price is the global price. That's what people use as a benchmark. Are you saying that they are at risk of losing their ability to price the bullion market? It could go east, could go China.
I think that's. I think the fix in the current form is dead. I think that there's no doubt. Deutsche Bank could not sell its seat for the gold fix, and I think that tells me quite clearly that the lawyers in the other bullion banks looked at this and said, well, in current circumstances, I don't think management we should get involved in this. So for whatever reason, I think that is dead. The point about the gold fix is that it draws in business which would otherwise occur after the fix, and it delays business which would otherwise occur before the business. So it is actually a distortion of the market. IOSCO, and don't ask me what IOSCO stands for, it's the sort of major international securities, standard setter and all the rest of it, have 19 points whereby a fix should comply with. It's thought that the London gold fix complies with 4 of them. We are nowhere up to standard.
Okay,
on the
so the
current
London
gold
gold fix, and we all know the London gold market's rigged, just like LIBOR's rigged.
Well, the point about this is that we don't know what the hell goes on, Max, and that is the thing that is wrong with the market. It is time it came out into the open, provided proper information to the participants.
Well, that's like the fix was actually old school market rigging. It's market rigging from before there was market rigging, because that was the whole idea of the fix, going back 100 years. I mean, you needed a fix 100 years ago. But in 24-hour markets around today, why do you have this daily fix?
The problem with the secrecy of the operation is I cannot deny your statement, and I should be able to.
Right. So China, of course, now with global geopolitics starting to heat up, and people are starting to look at their gold hoards, China, Russia in particular, and they're thinking, maybe we should divorce the pricing from London, and because they're wed to a paper mountain of empire of paper, and we want to get into the gold business.
It's going that way anyway, because if you look at China, I mean, for a start, the indications that I have quite clearly point to China keeping all her own gold production and all her own scrap production. As well as that, she has come to deals with mines all around the world for them to supply China doré, which she refines, and those bars are never seen on the international market. In other words, they're kept by China. So that
we're out of time.
Increasingly, it's bypassing London.
Okay, so we're out of time. We'll have to pick up on this next time. Alistair MacLeod, thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
That's my pleasure, Max.